Mighty man and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortune he has seen, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاجبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد، عاجبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد، راجل واحد مبدأ واحد،
عاش جيل ثورتنا عاش.
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد حرار. عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد حرار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية،
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أمة أبية.
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان ثورة مارد للحرية.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening at 22:30 of the 7th of February 2024, and we return to you today with the now daily live stream, which, as I've said before, is now the official competition of Newsnight in Britain. If you don't know what Newsnight is, imagine a very powerful belt sander being applied to your face and being told that that's the news for the day. So hopefully we can do better than that. So, good evening to everybody who is in the chat so far. I will do the customary greetings before we get to the issue at hand for this evening. Now, we have in the chat so far Banana Bender, who says good morning from the other end of the world, who is already into tomorrow. Albert Roundtree, hello to you. Après coup answers the question of the evening by saying Anglo-Atlanticist taxpayers. Well, we'll get to that. Gonzalo Cabrera, good evening to you. Carlos Chavez, good afternoon from Nicaragua. Good to have you with us. We've got the Revolution Report with us, which is excellent. Hello to the comrades behind that. And if you haven't watched their documentary on colour revolutions yet, be sure to do so on the Revolution Report channel. C. Bolt, good evening to you. Dan Lindstrom, good late evening from Sweden. Good to have you with us from the troubled Nordic lands, currently being absorbed into the doomed NATO alliance. Agitate, good evening. Is it to you, or are you already in tomorrow? I forget where you are. President Jesus, good afternoon to you out there in the land of Gavin Newsom's tyranny. And we've got Az Madhu Yibea, who's joined us. Good evening to you. Solaruiti, hello from Africa. Well, hello right back to you. Hello to you, Wan, who is joining us from the United States, I believe. Roddy, good evening to you, and good evening to Jenny. Greetings to CJ, who's driving home. Well, good that we can be your drive time commute, CJ. Good to have you with us. Ash, good morning to you down there in Melbourne. Good evening to Martin out there in the good old US of A. Oz, good evening to you. Arnold, hello. Adam Marks, greetings to you. Tristan, good evening. C. Bolt says, this is loads better than Newsnight. Most things are, mate. Most things are. Ash says, nice beard styling. Yes, that is the work of the Moroccan guy who runs the Turkish barbers down the road from me. Very reasonable rates. Very good evening to Otis, who joins us from the Democratic People's Republic of Newcastle upon Tyne. I really must make it up there sometime. I haven't been to Newcastle in a good many years. Always a good evening out, though, I must say. So, with that in mind, I will ask everybody, if you haven't done so already, be sure to like and share the stream at however many social media networks you are engaged in that haven't been censored already. And good evening to Morgan, who has just joined us. So, what is the item under discussion this evening? Well, for those of you who enjoy finance, it's a market-heavy episode in some respects, because I thought it to be interesting to look at the question of, well, how is the Israeli regime paying for its war? And it's an interesting question because, of course, it tells us a great deal about the actual relationship that the Israeli regime has with the US imperialism in how it supports itself. And to looking at this, and there was a few stories on this, but not all that many when I was searching around for this. So, for instance, CNBC had a story. The Financial Times has had a few stories on it. There was one story in The Guardian, but the amounts that they were giving seemed very off. And so the most reliable reporting that I found on this was in the Financial Times. Now, we all know, of course, that the long-term support of the US imperialists for their Israeli colonial project, which is what it is, it's a US colony, has been, of course, in existence for a very long time, this support. It's been extensive, and it is there because, as Joe Biden himself said back in his more coherent and a brief, honest moment back in the 1980s, he said very clearly, we support Israel because it's in our interest. Were there not an Israel, we would have to create an Israel to look after our interests. And you can trace the full extent of the support that US imperialism is giving Israel in some rather easy ways. For instance, you can just take a look at the fact that even like Vox reports that at least 14.3 billion in military aid has been given to Israel since October the 7th, which when you consider that the military action on October the 7th was committed by men who are armed at best in terms of their heavy equipment with rocket-propelled grenades, and the US has to rush $14.3 billion worth of military equipment, and a significant amount also is coming from the British government as well. And I have to rush all that to Israel just to prop it up, just to make sure that the system doesn't turn in on itself and implode. That tells you a great deal about just how stable or indeed unstable the Israeli regime is. So you've got the headline figure of 14.3 billion in military aid. That's a fairly basic starting point. But the US has also been backstopping Israel in various different ways. And one of those is, of course, aiding Israel in raising money in terms of its sale of bonds. Of course, the United States and Britain and anyone else with a tradable currency does this. But the Israel bonds, of course, are bought overwhelmingly by the United States, Britain and some European countries. But the biggest buyer is, of course, the United States itself. So this was covered a while back in the Financial Times itself. So this was a story from November 17th, 2023. I'll just call up the relevant part of the story so you can see which article I am referring to. So there you go. Israel raises $6 billion in borrowing bonanza to fund war against Hamas. So the costs associated with the Israel war, if you've all taken that in, I'll just transition back again. And I'll put the link to this story in the chat so you can all see it. I, of course, obtained access to this article in a wholly legal way, and you can too. And the question of like the war and its expenses isn't just a question of Israel funding its military. There's other costs involved as well. For instance, they mobilized initially over 600,000 reservists. They called up like almost everybody they possibly could who could still stagger around and carry a gun. And they've kept at least 300,000 of them mobilized since then, which is 300,000 mostly men, but of course some women. They're the ones who shoot civilians in a girl power style, and also, of course, do TikTok videos. But also, I should mention, for the purposes of balance between the sexes, that Israeli idiotic men also make excruciating and bizarre and cruel and completely sort of torture porn TikTok videos as well. So they're all equally pathetic. That's true. That's a true triumph for the liberal conception of equality right there. So they are keeping hundreds of thousands of men and some women out of the workplace. And so they're having to provide a significant amount of economic assistance to these businesses who have had their workforce taken away to go and serve in the armed forces. So that's a significant expense. They also have the additional cost of the fact that they've had to evacuate almost all of the northern border area because of the ongoing clashes with Hezbollah, which, of course, various members of the Israeli cabinet keep threatening to go to war with, but don't actually move. And now Blinken's trying to sell some sort of deal to the Hezbollah leadership. So there's that expense as well, because they've got all these people living in hotels. They're having to pay for them to stay there. They've had to evacuate a load of people also from the south around the conflict zone around Gaza. So all of these costs mount up. So you've got also the costs of the very effective, as it turned out, Yemeni naval blockade. which is starving the ports of Eilat of business, adding additional costs to importers. A lot of importers are having to dump their cargo off onto trucks that go through Saudi Arabia into Jordan, then into Israel, and then back onto a boat again to go out of another Israeli port on the Mediterranean coast. So the costs of this to both to Israel and its capitalist class are growing all the time and escalating. And when the military operation on October the 7th took place, the Israeli economy immediately started to look incredibly shaky. It's always portrayed as a very strong high-tech economy, and I really am convinced after looking into this that this is really a product not of the strength of Israeli capitalism as such. It's a product of the fact that there is confidence in the Israeli state because there is confidence that the US and to a large extent the European imperialists will always back it up, and therefore it's almost as safe a bet as the dollar itself for now. But there are, of course, additional risks that have come in with this. Now, I'll get to the risks that are being registered for investors in just a moment. But the fact is that as soon as the October the 7th raid had commenced and had been the operation there by the Palestinian National Liberation Forces had been completed, the Israeli economy started to look very shaky. Investors started to lose confidence. There was stories of capital flight out of the country and a lot of people leaving Israel. So the US then moved to shore it up, not just with military aid either, but with, as the headline from the Financial Times indicates, the purchase of at least $6 billion in Israel bond purchases, which of course helps bolster the Israeli currency and helps reassure international investors inside Israel that, again, that this is a nation which is still a safe bet because the US will backstop it no matter what. And that's ultimately what is has caused the confidence in, or part of what's caused some confidence in the investor community, shall we say, to return, because still the number one economy in the world, if you believe the ratings, though we could have another separate discussion on how economic ratings are actually constructed, the validity of GDP as an economic measurement, etc. But let's have that another time. Needless to say, the perception of the US as still the number one economic power in the world, the country that has an unlimited ability to print money at this stage, it seems, and also the image of the US as this number one all-powerful country, which still exists in the mind of, I think, certain investors, especially in the Western world, helped restore some confidence in Israel, as was, of course, this is part of the reason why Netanyahu is out there all the time doing these videos where he looks like a man attending his own funeral, saying, we will win, we will carry on, we will do what we must, we will not stop until we have crushed Hamas, we will win, etc. Now, part of that, of course, a big part of that is him trying to secure himself politically and project a confident image to a population which is becoming more and more disturbed. But also, it's to, again, reassure the markets, reassure the investors, let them know that he is firmly in control, that the war will be fought to a decisive finish. But, of course, the war isn't being fought to a decisive finish. They're losing more and more men. They are unable to achieve their stated aims. Now, you can say, of course, as many do, that their stated aims are different to their actual aims, and their actual aims are to carry out a gigantic act of ethnic cleansing, then essentially bulldoze the entire Gaza Strip and then settle it with Israelis. Now, of course, that is the aim of Netanyahu and some of his crew. But the fact that he came out and said that his stated aim is the destruction of Hamas, and that even in the US now, amongst former military officers appearing on bourgeois channels, that he is they're saying that he's been unable to meet that aim and will continue to be unable to meet it. Well, even if you take it that he was lying about that aim, the fact that he's publicly stated it over and over again and has been unable to do it, they've been unable to release the hostages, there's been more and more stories inside Israel itself of the fact that the hostages have been killed by Israeli military action. The hostages' families are making more and more noise and are gaining more and more political support. All this is very damaging, not just for Netanyahu, but for Israel as an investable country. Now, so how is the US backstopping Israel when it comes to this? Well, the Israel bonds that I mentioned just a moment ago, these are bought on a really wide basis by a lot of US public entities, not just on the private markets, but a lot of them are bought by state governments. So a lot of this $6 billion in purchases came from the state governments of Florida, New York, Alabama, Arizona, Ohio, Illinois, Texas, Georgia, Oklahoma, Nevada, Louisiana, South Carolina, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. It's quite a list. And that's just the list that the Financial Times and the CNBC stories were carrying. And they were carrying it as like, the CNBC story was ridiculous. It's just a sort of, hey, good news, Israel's still a viable investment. Buy your Israel bond now story. And the fact that so many of them have bought these is quite telling. Because the fact that they also hold a significant amount of these, like for instance, New York State holds a significant number of shares in Israel bonds. I believe the figure is at least $267 million worth of Israel bonds are held by New York State, and of course, it's the New York State Pension Fund, so the public pension fund, which buys a lot of these up. So this will also be the case, and I think in a lot of the states that are buying these up, it's often the public pension funds, a lot of the time teachers' pension funds, that go and purchase these bonds. And of course, the big amount of bonds being bought means that more confidence returns to investors with regard to Israel, and the fact that Israel can raise this $6 billion on the markets by selling bonds, of course, makes Israel bonds more appealing to perhaps other investors. But there's another side to this which is worth mentioning, and it's also that the market is an unsentimental place. Of course, many Zionists in positions of power in the United States, people who believe in the Israeli colonial project, want to continue to support it for now, but the people taking the bets on Israel's debt and the people being asked to look at Israel's debt don't think it's as safe as it used to be. And here I draw your attention to the graph that was carried in the Financial Times article. Now take a look at the giant spike there that took place after, of course, the later period of last year. And that is, of course, a gigantic jump in the cost of Israel's debt, the insurance that you would have to take out if you held Israeli debt. It's a big jump. It's a slight decline there at the end. But either way, that's like gone from being what you would regard as a relatively safe bet to a rather unsafe one. So it's clear that in the marketplace, those who are buying and selling Israeli bonds, whilst are happy to do so at the moment, still many people are starting to think that this is an increasingly unsafe bet. So it's another interesting detail that in the short term, the US ruling class has proven again the fact that this is a colonial operation by rushing out to make sure that its Israeli colony is taken care of. But at the same time, the cost of insuring the debt goes up. More and more investors are looking at it as long-term, perhaps a little bit more unsafe than safe. It's also worth mentioning that the Israel bonds, which we have been talking about here, have been sold in the United States since 1951. In fact, the Israel bonds, the agency that sells them, is a US-registered entity. So it's the company that deals in these is registered in the United States. But of course, it's operated by the Israeli Ministry of Finance. And this is another interesting detail, which is when you look at like how Israel often finances itself, and where its money often comes from. Of course, its origin lies within the United States, not just with, as some might say, like certain Jewish communities, but with US public institutions, US pension funds, which take out these investments in Israel. Why? Well, we know why, because when you are running this colonial enterprise over there, you can see that it is the the U.S. ruling class can see that it is in, of course, their class interest to make sure that this colonial entity continues to succeed. Because, again, we must revisit the reasons why Israel was created in the first place, to make sure that the Arab world, the Arab lands, remained divided into a group of weak states run by compradors, and that the Israelis would be there as the insurance policy to make sure that always remained the case, and that any project towards Arab unity, whether it was socialist-led or not, would always be train-wrecked by the actions of the Israeli regime acting as the armed encampment for US imperialism in the region. And the reason for the creation of that entity by the British imperialists 100 years ago is the same reason why the US absolutely will not abandon the Israeli colonial project, and why it rushed to bolster its economic outlook as soon as October the 7th happened. So these are interesting details which haven't been covered to the same extent that they should do. So not only have they forwarded to Israel 14.3 billion of military assistance, and that's the figure they're admitting to, they've also raised for them at least 6 billion in terms of bond buying. So that's over 20 billion in total that the US ruling class, through one method or another, has assisted this gigantic act of mass slaughter in Gaza. Because without that military assistance, and without, and I think this is crucial to emphasize, the immediate support that was provided to the Israeli economy by the coordinated mass purchasing of Israel bonds, then Israel would be in a very difficult situation right now. They would have run out of ammunition and their economy would have collapsed. So I know that nobody who's watching this stream, or very few of you, will actually believe the lies that Tony Blinken engages in when he goes around the Middle East on these trips and says he's trying to find a solution. Don't believe anything that any of them say about two-state solutions or justice for the Palestinians, if they ever utter that phrase, or finding a long-term peaceful solution. No. The actual truth of their actions lies in the figures, in the numbers. So, gigantic amounts of military assistance every single day, I think. Resupplying them with bombs, resupplying them with artillery shells, redirecting stuff that was going to go to Ukraine to Israel. Because whereas the Ukraine project is important, if Israel looked like it was going to stumble and fall, well, everything has to be pulled out. All the stops have to be pulled out to make sure that that does not happen. So over 20 billion at least in various different forms of military and financial assistance coordinated by the US ruling class since October the 7th. And it's an ongoing project. The sales of Israel bonds in the United States are ongoing, and it's something that the various different public institutions are investing in. One thing which I'm sure is being looked at by various US Palestinian solidarity activists is to just do a simple check as to whether their state government is investing public sector pensions into Israel bonds. I mean, that's a prime target for a boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign right there. I mean, just read out all those states which are investing and have bought up Israel bonds since October of last year. Well, they should all be targeted in terms of a divestment campaign. Think of all the public money, or the public sector pension funds money, that's gone into supporting a genocide. Think that the trustees of a pension scheme may be concerned about that? Well, probably not. But certainly a lot of the pension scheme members might be. And a lot of people in the wider population will certainly be. I mean, you've got these big Arab American and Muslim communities up in Michigan and Illinois. And the Illinois state government is one of the biggest buyers of Israel bonds. Surely that could be turned into a political issue. So there's a lot of stuff there to work with. And once you start to dig into the true extent of the support provided by US imperialism to the Israeli client state or colonial state, you can see that, again, like nothing Blinken says, nothing Biden says, nothing the Democrats say, any of them, by the way, whether they're the more rabid types like Chuck Schumer, who will be Israel till he carks it, or the sort of meandering leftists like Cortez or Jayapal or any of the others who proclaim therefore the ceasefire or something like that, but crumble immediately under pressure and just go back to babbling about Trump again. None of them mean any of this for a second, because the truth is in the amount of support that goes to Israel, and that nobody's doing anything to tackle other than people doing street activism, basically. The US ruling class stands almost uniformly behind Israel. They're more uniform about that even than the Ukraine question. In fact, there's serious rows in the US bourgeois political system now about the Ukraine question that continue to go on and actually holding up potential assistance to the Kiev regime. With regard to Israel, though, complete unanimity on every single conceivable level. It's a completely unified ruling class position in the United States that the Israeli colonial project must continue to be supported, which is kind of the opposite to what you've got here. What you've got in Britain is complete unanimity around the war in Ukraine, complete unanimity around essentially a long-term plan to regime change the government headed by Vladimir Putin out of power in Moscow and to try and install a puppet regime there. The bourgeois politicians here are completely unified around that. They're much more divided over the Israel question. There's much more space for debate within the bourgeois press in Britain about the Israel question. About the Ukraine question, there's no room for debate whatsoever. So I think that's a bit of an interesting comparison there. The destruction and the breaking up of Russia, that project, is much more hysterically supported here than it is in the United States. And I think that comes down to the fact that the crisis of British imperialism is much more intense because it's the smaller junior partner. US imperialism still has an awful lot of capital stashed in Wall Street. It still has an awful lot of capital washing through it. It has a bigger industrial base. Its ruling class is immeasurably more powerful than the British ruling class. And therefore its fall will take longer to manifest itself. If the Ukraine project goes wrong, then not only is it the case that the British ruling class is even more fucked, but also so is the French and the German and the Italian. So the Europeans are becoming much more fundamentalist about the Ukraine issue, whilst wavering and contradicting themselves and saying and having to come up with elaborate lies about the Israel question. It's the reason why the Tories here, the ruling government, have come out and said, oh, they're in favour of a two-state solution. It means nothing, of course, but the fact that they've had to do that tells me that they are much more divided and worried about the Israel question than about on the Ukraine question. Total utter unanimity. So we'll pause there to take a few comments from the floor. Where are we? So Jenny says, worst propaganda of all time with regard to Israel TikTok videos. Yeah, I mean, you have to wonder what the hell they're doing. Like doing all these like bizarre videos of like high-fiving and jumping around and dancing in front of a building being demolished, or taking selfies when they're torturing somebody. I mean, that was a really fucking weird one. The other day, you might have seen it, where there was this Israeli soldier and another Israeli member of the Israeli army. It took a photo of him staring down at this Palestinian guy who sat, obviously showing clear signs of he looked like he'd been shot in the leg and beaten. And he sat there chained to a chair and bleeding. He sat there looking very, very defiant at this like horrendous pipsqueak who's presumably done this to him. And like they think that makes them look good. So like the guy who comes out of that looking positively heroic is the man who's been tortured, who's like not only kept himself together, but he's still wearing a look of defiance on his face. The torturer looks completely feeble and pathetic. But they're putting all this stuff out there, and it does raise the question as to why. Because not only does this, of course, damage them in terms of international opinion, which they don't think matters at the moment, but they will learn that it does in the end. But also, like, it's like extremely poor for like the international legal case that they just had to fight. The fact that all the South Africans needed to do was to track all the statements that Israeli political figures had made, and that military figures had made, and that media personalities had made. And anybody who wanted to look this up could find like a million TikTok videos of like Israeli army idiots like dancing around and blowing up buildings, or Israeli civilians making like really strange, like very unfunny, like racist videos about like trying to mock the pain and misery of the Palestinian population. Not only do they come across as like bizarre racist, which if you've ever met any Israelis, you will know that's certainly a defining characteristic of them. I remember when I met an ex-IDF guy in Malaysia when I was doing some hiking there years ago now, 2007, and like obviously I'd met prior to that like guys in the British like fascist organisations. I'd run into them, and like they had nothing on this guy. This guy was like so racist, and not just against Arabs, against everybody. Anybody with slightly darker skin than him, which is of course a very bitter irony that many of the soldiers used as cannon fodder now in the Israeli army are of Ethiopian and Arab origin. But there is a reason, of course, they do all this shit. Why they do like the bizarre dancing videos, the videos of like some guy dressed as a T-Rex loading up a mortar round into it and firing it off, like all the videos of themselves doing war crimes. It's all for domestic consumption. It's all a gigantic performance basically it's a really poor attempt at reasserting like what you might call colonial dominance. Like the attack on October the 7th has basically made sure that nothing in Israel will ever be the same again, even if they attained their objectives in this military operation. And so what they're doing by engaging in all these acts of like grotesque and performances of cruelty and torture and murder on camera is that they are trying to reassert themselves in the eyes of their own public. The IDF was horribly damaged by being defeated on October the 7th. Not only were they defeated, they were completely humiliated. Their best divisions were destroyed in battle, caught with their pants down. Many of them were taken captive, including very senior officers who are presumably still held captive. And not only that, but they lost their entire intelligence network in Gaza. The Palestinian forces took loads of IT assets with them. It contained details of Israeli intelligence operations, not just in Gaza, but elsewhere. It's a complete humiliation. So all of this, like torture, murder, mass brutality, mass murder, is essentially a pathetic attempt to appear as if they are still strong. But every single video that they release that gets put out there that shows them doing all this stuff, it just convinces people. Not only does it make people actively fucking despise them, which, is natural, but, the equal amount of hatred should be reserved for the enablers, Britain and the United States. But also it just makes them look incredibly weak, like incredibly feeble. Like that, the man being tortured in that chair had way more humanity to him and was a far braver individual than any of those clowns who did that to him will ever be. And yet they're the ones that took the picture and put it out there. And so this is a society that's disintegrating. This is not a society which is doing well. I mean, if the French occupiers in Algeria had had social media and TikTok, they would have done the same thing. I mean, the British in Malaysia did similar things. I mean, it's fairly early days of personal photography back then, but there's pictures of them chopping off Malaysian communists' heads and holding it up to the camera. So it's not new. I mean, the colonial occupying armies behave always in the same way when they've suffered a defeat or an act of defiance has been performed. I mean, Frantz Fanon talks about this at great length. They have to, because the figure of the native has revolted, and has inflicted a defeat against not just against them militarily, but on a civilizational basis almost. The figure of the native isn't meant to be able to possibly hope to defeat this immeasurably superior force, technologically superior, but also racially superior, and also just a level of civilization which is so far above them that they can't possibly hope to even touch it. And all of that is destroyed on October the 7th. And so what you have there is a sort of a triple level of defeat and humiliation that they go crazy trying to make up for. It's why, of course, the war in Algeria was so cruel back in the day. It's why the British colonial wars were so horrific in Malaysia and in Kenya and other places as well. And the French do the same thing in Madagascar as well. And it all comes back to this sort of triple combination of lies that the settlers are told and that they tell themselves, which is, of course, civilizational supremacy. And that's separate to racial supremacy, because the civilizational aspect here, it comes out in with the when you start to dig in to the concept of the West. What does the West mean? And this also is displayed in the way that they talk about the Russians and in Ukraine, and the way that Ukrainian compradors go around talking about how they're the shield of the West. What they fail to understand is that the shield is there to get battered into dust and ashes, whilst the man behind it survives, ideally. But there's a reason why all this is bigged up. It's because this is a sort of mobilizing ideology for principally the ruling class, really. The idea of a defense of the West doesn't really work anymore, even in Britain. I mean, if you looked at the response since that idiot Boris Johnson and his crew started talking about conscription, even right-wing forces have said no. And they've said no because they don't believe, these reactionary types in England, that the political establishment represents what they regard as Western values. And from the point of view of these often extremely online reactionaries, that's true. But also more specifically about the British case. And maybe the American case is a little bit different. I'm sure our American friends can chip in with a contribution on this. In British terms, the message of the ruling class to Britain, to the working class in particular, is that to quote Margaret Thatcher, there is no such thing as society, only individuals and their families, meaning that there's no wider sense of collective responsibility. Your only responsibility is to look after yourself and your family. It's the Ben Shapiro line, basically. He got it from Margaret Thatcher, as it turned out, who had it written for her by probably Tim Bell, who took it from Milton Friedman. But they've essentially been saying, there's no such thing as society. There's no such thing as a collective anymore. The nation basically exists for footballing terms. There's not been a call-up in Britain since 1959. Like my uncle was in the last call-up, and he served in Georgetown, Malaysia. So as Ash says in the comments, Constantine Kissin and Douglas Murray talking about war to defend Western civilization, strangely enough, doesn't actually win many converts in the proletariat. And as was discussed the other day, when Douglas Murray tried to hold a pro-Israel event in London recently, the staff all walked out of the bar that he was supposed to hold this in, and refused to work even for triple pay. So, and then Douglas Murray took to Twitter, as he usually does, moaning about how, oh my God, the West is finished, it's all over. And in a strange way, he's not wrong. He's a grifter and a scumbag, but the conception of the West is finished. Because fundamentally the economic basis of the West is finished. It's hollowed out. It's all over. This is a situation now where the major powers in Europe are all living on borrowed time. It's only a matter of time before the crunch comes and the economies start to stagnate and then collapse. which is there's a strong argument to say that that's happening already. And then you'll see just how bad it is when you've got 60 plus years of the only message that the ruling class gives out is "fuck you, you're on your own," and we're taking all the concessions back, and and you're not getting anything off us anymore. So the Western publics were told that, well, you might not have strong trade unions anymore. You might not have some of those concessions that came in this high period of social democracy, but you've still got enough to make life fairly bearable. And if you keep your nose out of politics, you'll be given enough credit to get by. And you can buy yourself a nice 128-inch television. And of course, now all of that is getting withdrawn, and the layers who still had some concessions made to them, the petty bourgeoisie in the form of the landowner, the small and medium-sized landowners in all of the countries in Europe now revolting, all the concessions now being withdrawn from them, or many of them being withdrawn. They're now reacting, and now you're starting to see just how hollowed out the collective West, to use that term, the U.S. imperialist bloc really is. It doesn't have any collective spirit to even carry out its imperial wars anymore, which is why, of course, it fielded its armies from recruits taken from the poorest and most desperate sections of Britain, or in the case of the United States, a lot of people who joined the army to get speeded up immigration status. But in terms of like some great rallying cry to go off and fight Tsar Putin the last, nobody's responding. So all these like online rightists are now having a big meltdown, the ones who want to defend civilization. And they finally realized that, well, 60 plus years of promoting nothing but individualism has finally come back to bite them on the ass, because people feel no attachment, for a variety of reasons, to this state or this civilization that they're always going on about, because for the working class, it's delivering nothing to them anymore. And even for large sections of the petty bourgeoisie, they've been taught for their entire lives only look as far as their own nose. So this is a completely hollowed out society where the government now is discovering that it's drawing up all these plans, like we're going to rebuild shipping, we're going to rebuild the army, we're going to rebuild the energy industry, we're going to rebuild our nuclear industry that we let fall into ruins. Oh shit, we can't do any of it. Oh shit, it's going to take 10 years and an astronomical amount of money. And oh shit, the state's too corrupt to actually oversee a decent procurement process. Well, looks like we're fucked. So yes, let's go, a rather long digression there. But let's go back to comments in the chat. We've had a fair few come in. Our Western elites still think the US is number one. Yes, Dan Lindstrom, that will take a while to be dispelled. Banana Bender says, Israel needs $6 billion while Palestine uses materials from destroyed buildings. Goes to show the asymmetry. Yeah, here. Yeah, you can't buy fighting spirit, as it turns out, no matter how much they try. Saludos from Alicante says, unused sub. Good evening to Brad. Wayne says, if the US collapsed, the GDP and stock market may still be looking right up to the end. Looking great right up to the end. That shit is meaningless. Yeah, it is. You'll get like a stock report saying Dow Jones has best ever day. The moment that Trump, to start the Civil War, fires Hunter Biden out of a cannon at the US Capitol building or something. And they'll declare record profits for Wall Street, optimistic times ahead. Now over to Jim Cramer. So where are we now? Wayne says there is no equivalent to Trump in Britain, and the reality that the two parties don't represent the people is more of a stark reality. Hopefully something comes of that. Well, something might. I think that the economic situation worsening, combined with a complete disillusionment in the political system, means troubled times ahead for the British ruling class, and they know it now, which is why they're worrying. Banana Bender says, did you see Millet crying at the Wailing Wall? Oh my God, I mean, this guy, I mean, the fixation of like the extremely reactionary types, not just in South America on Israel. I mean, is understandable in some senses because it is like a colonial project, and therefore the worst comprador elements will be rabidly in favor of it. I know that Bolsonaro was sort of an embarrassing Zionist, but I don't think Bolsonaro ever started weeping. Milei is such a weirdo, and he's so like pathetic. That's the thing about him. Like, he tries really, really hard to be the sort of macho guy, you know, but everything he does just comes across as like small man syndrome. I mean, going over there and like fucking crying and saying he's going to convert to Judaism because like that's the most manly thing he can think of to do. He's not converting, to Judaism, as the more orthodox anti-Zionist rabbis will tell you. He's not converting to Judaism. He's converting to Zionism, and those are two different things entirely. I believe it was various rabbis have like written books on this about the fact, of course, that Judaism means having a relationship with the Torah and developing your faith through that, not a worship, an idolatrous worship of the state of Israel. But Milei is no more into sort of Jewish spirituality than I am. What he's into is the image of Israel. That's what he's converting to. He wants to convert to Zionism. The Judaism bit is just sort of something you have to swear to that you're into so you can get access to the Zionism, full access to the Zionism. Because, of course, you can be a Zionist without being Jewish. But, yeah, just bizarre, like, just strange behavior. The guy's unstable. I mean, this is why he's unstable, and he's clearly, as I said on last night's broadcast, he's just a puppet. Like, anybody who's that weird, he'll fly off the handle into like and do bizarre things like that. He's probably got an awful lot of dirt on him as well, an awful lot of strange things that he's been up to in his spare time. The cosplay is the publicly presentable side of it. He's very easily controllable, very easily blackmailed, very easily manipulated. But the rightist like attraction to Israel is just reveals how utterly empty and pathetic they are. Right, where are we now? Good evening to Beiju. The Israelis have managed to be the least relatable people on earth. Yeah, there's an old song from the 1980s program Spitting Image. I've never met a nice South African. It was called. Could basically apply that to Israel now. Israelis have a history of dancing when buildings are demolished, says Pittsburgh Dude 87. Yes, correct. The dancing Israelis on 9/11. I wonder what they were celebrating. Good evening to Ghost of John Judge. Evening, comrades, says Ian Foster, who's catching up. Yes, the whole scenario of the dancing Israelis showed undoubtable pre-knowledge on somebody's part. Yeah. We should really do a 9/11 program at one stage. That could last for hours, and then we would get banned. Maybe it's something to do just purely on Rumble. Yuan says, Israel was involved in supporting compradors in the civil war in Lebanon in 1975, a war that was planned in the late 60s primarily to destroy the Arab left. Israel is a bona fide imperial project. Yeah, well, certainly that's the case. The Lebanese civil war is one of the most disgusting acts of imperial cynicism and manipulation that has happened in recent decades. And then, of course, to end it, the imperialists and their comprador agents imposed a sectarian constitution on Lebanon that was meant to not solve the problems but entrench them. Remember what we've said before about the operations of the British and also the American imperialists. When they want to make sure that they get entrenched in a region, what they do is, of course, they find some comprador agents to put in charge. They find a minority who they can stick in charge of things and have as their local agent, who will then be despised by most of the locals. And they make sure that there's religious or ethnic tension stirred up everywhere they go, knowing that that's, of course, from their point of view, that's the antidote to class politics and the politics of anti-colonial nationalism. And the compradors are always willing to get involved in that kind of shit as long as they can be king of their particular shitty little castle. So the priority of destroying the Lebanese or the wider Arab left and the revolutionary elements within it was something that Israel was the primary mover for in Lebanon in the 1970s and 1980s. And they succeeded in that, but of course in doing so created one of their own gravediggers in the form of Hezbollah. The videos make Israelis look soft, says Oz, and that's completely correct. Martin says there's an air of unreality in everyday life in the United States, but that seems even more extreme in Israel. It's the same here. I mean, I think for us, those of us who have researched the true state of things, the air of unreality is more pronounced, because once you've read Marxism to a certain point and you understand not only the cyclical crisis-prone nature of capitalism, but also the fact that it's in a terminal crisis now and can only be resolved, a crisis that can only be resolved by the most horrendous wars and violence, and yet the things are sort of drifting along in this strange haze. It's going to take some getting used to. I mean, it's a level of unreality that a lot of things seem to be happening in, that I'm sure will change when things start to bite more. Jenny says, it's scary how unaware of their own psychopathy they are, and they're clueless as to how normal, sane people perceive them. Well, this is what happens when you live in a complete bubble. I mean, the ultimate source of this is the fact that they are backed up by US imperialism no matter what. And so they are believing that anything they do is, well, it doesn't matter, because they feel perpetually secure, because they have the backing of the most powerful imperialist country in the world. That will go in the end, and then they will be left very much pissing in the wind. And at that point, of course, the other people who will go, and we've said this before, will be the Israeli bourgeois. The Israeli bourgeois and the petty bourgeois who are rich enough to flee and have another passport will all be on planes out of there when things really go south, when the US bails, which in the end it will. Might not be tomorrow or the day after, but it's coming. And then, of course, the Israelis who have no money, or little money, no passports, no other state to go to, will be left facing the music. And that's something to think about. Banana Bender says, the AFD supports Israel, but Nick Griffin and his kind don't. Interesting. Well, yes, the AFD, I mean, when I see people get excited about the AFD, I know that they can't have actually read anything the AFD stands for. I mean, we should really revisit again on a future stream the whole sovereignist argument, because it's tremendously weak. This part of there's this idea that people like Pepe Escobar pushed, saying that there's going to be a transition to a new Westphalian system. But this is nonsense. I mean, this is a fantasy. It's a fantasy of the multipolarists that US imperialism is just going to, accept its defeat lying down? They may withdraw from certain places in the world. They may have to rearrange the way that they have rearranged the way they do business. But they are going to scheme to find ways to cling on in as many areas as they can. They will get pushed out of the Middle East in the end. They will get pushed out. They will give up on Europe in the end. But it's going to be a long, protracted struggle. There's this belief amongst some people, mainly sort of social democratic reformist types of various different descriptions, that there's going to be a moment where the US ruling class just suddenly decides to be sensible. I mean, you can see this tendency within the Chinese leadership as well. I think the Russians have finally had it kicked out of them by US imperialism itself that there's going to be no negotiation and there's going to be no reasonableness on offer here. I think some in the Chinese leadership are still hoping that the US will come to its senses. But of course it can't come to its senses because it's in this gigantic, very long-term crisis, which is necessitating more and more aggressive behavior towards those who the US imperialists regard as a threat, which now includes Russia, China, Iran. So they won't stop being aggressive till they are prevented from doing so, either by an internal collapse brought about, hopefully, by the actions of the US proletariat, led by a communist party, hopefully, in some point in the future, or by internal political problems which force them to rearrange their activities, or they're defeated militarily and visibly defeated militarily. or that their proxies go down. Like when Ukraine does go down, which it is in the process of doing so, then that will be severely damaging for the United States, because suddenly all the compradors who've been probably lying to themselves and having the US lie to them about how, oh, that Ukraine thing going great, don't worry about it. Anyway, let's see about how we can get more of your oil onto the market or something like that. Suddenly all the compradors who have been solidly in the US column for decades will look at the fact that the US spent big on this Ukraine project, gambled big, invested in a major way, and it all went to shit, and they ended up being pushed out and losing the whole place. Then even the most loyal compradors will start to look askance at their options. I mean, this is part of the reason why the Saudis, who are the worst counter-revolutionary comprador influence in the Middle East, they are, and have been for a long time, partners with the Israeli regime, even though they pretend they're not. They are. And they have been invested in very heavily by British and US imperialism to do the same thing that the Israelis do, which is the Israelis are there to create division and to prevent Arab unity. The Saudis are there to do exactly the same thing. But the fact that such a wretched reactionary comprador group, even they reached a point where they were looking at the US and thinking, hang on, this isn't looking too good. We better start spreading our bets here, or we might end up going down with it. That tells you everything you need to know about how the comprador elements are even starting to getting a bit worried about the US as a long-term viable prospect. And the Saudis will have a few advantages, of course, because they've got the enormous oil supplies. They dominate a lot of the oil market. But even smaller compradors will start to look at this and think, well, perhaps we need better options. And again, so the defeat coming in Ukraine will be a tremendously significant moment in terms of the US's ability to keep its alliances lined up in the way that it likes, in a way that favors its interests. But with regard to going back to Bernardo Bender's point about the AFD, like completely, they're just like a sort of reactionary version of Die Linke. A more reactionary version of Die Linke. They just reflect all of the prejudices and interests of the German bourgeois. They're a little bit less keen on the war with Russia. That's about all the major difference. That, and they're less keen on the EU, though their position on the EU is, I think, seems to be contradictory. It's the same with Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. Like, he'll say like anti-EU things, but he's got a long history of like being a very standard EU Dutch sort of right-wing liberal. And the same is true for a lot of people in the AFD leadership. They wouldn't lead a serious campaign against the EU unless, of course, the German ruling class's interests had moved in a significantly different direction, which at the moment they're not. At the moment, the German ruling class's interest is still in not only being in the EU, but subjugating other nations in the EU via the EU's mechanisms, as they did with Greece. So people who get enthusiastic about the AFD, I know that they're not looking too hard at it, or that their politics are very, very shallow. Now, Nick Griffin and his gang, though that's a case of, and I'm going to use a US term here, Griffin is a long-term, this is my interpretation, he and the other fascist leaders in Britain, going all the way back to like things like the League of St. George and other creepy organizations that were stuffed with like military officers and upper crust types. All fascism ultimately emanates and has its origins within the bourgeoisie. And this is true also of the National Front, which was where Griffin got his political start, and the BNP. They don't come into existence unless certain people in the ruling class are paying their bills. Like when you see these fascist operations, whether it's NF, BNP, English Defence League, Patriotic Alternative, take your pick of arseholes, they usually pop up with a decent-sized budget and the ability to print a lot of material in colour on good quality paper very quickly and get it out across a wide variety of houses, especially if they're wanting to make a run at a particular area. And trust me, I've done budgeting for very low level political campaigning sometimes, and even just to cover a small estate costs a lot of money, and that's with a poorly printed leaflet. To do the kind of business that these guys do and these organisations have done when the ruling class has decided that they need them, takes resources, and those kind of resources only two places have, either big private donors or the state or both. So Nick Griffin is a long-term asset of the British state. And as is, by the way, Stephen Yaxley Lennon, whose stage name is Tommy Robinson. And the British state employs them for various different purposes, and we can go into that into another time. But the reason why, like, Griffin and those two guys come out as anti-Israel is simply because, A, it's their strange form of fascism that they claim adherence to. But the reason why Griffin is allowed to go around saying what he does is because essentially, like, he and his group are being used to, again, to use the US term, to shitcoat anti-Zionism. By associating it with Griffin, then you get to taint anybody else by association. That's why he's going around saying what he does. He's doing services for the British state, as he's always done. Tommy Robinson, of course, is even more of a moron than Nick Griffin, so he's going around sort of drooling away and saying how much of a Zionist he is. But they're all servants of the British bourgeois, ultimately. Right. Ghost of John Judge says, I believe they see the unwavering support of the US wavering, and its days are numbered, so they might feel they have to expedite completion of their Zionist project before the US falls. Yes, please excuse my redundant use of wavering. It is excused, Ghost. This is an interesting point, which is that there are undoubtedly some inside Israel, such as Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and others, who think that they can make a rush to do some sort of maximalist, big-time Zionist project in this opportunity that's been presented to them. And they would be right if they hadn't just proved in Gaza that their army can't do shit. Like, what we're going to say? I mean, they think now that they can go and march on Hezbollah? They'd be defeated worse than they were in 2006. Like, I know, and they can't go after Syria because Syria has got essentially the Russians guaranteeing their security. If they try to go after Iran, they'll be destroyed. I mean, what are they going to do? Invade Jordan? When the King of Jordan's been like a dedicated servant of Zionism for his entire miserable career. They could try getting up to some business in Egypt, but again, like, that would just guarantee one of two things: either the overthrow of the al-Sisi regime, or the Egyptian army would be compelled into fighting them. So they have all these like grand ideas and ambitions, and they're like shooting off all over the place with them, but ultimately they can't do any of them. Like, they try and make war in many of these directions, and it will only lead to their own defeat and a disaster for them. Banana Bender says, I didn't even think Nazi subordinates were this sadistic. Oh, they were. They just didn't have TikTok. Like, if you read up on, I mean, like, Einsatzgruppen guys on the Eastern Front, like, the shit that the Israelis are doing now, yeah, those guys did all of that, like, to even worse degrees sometimes. It's just often that some of them did take pictures. I've seen some, like, even some of them took like home movies, like in very early sort of like portable cameras. But most of it was only photographed at a distance. So some of it by resistance fighters, some of it by German army photographers. But yeah, the level of sadism on display now was on full display, particularly in the East. But of course, it comes from ultimately the imperial relationship. Like, you look at, like, again, how the French acted in Algeria, how the Germans acted in Namibia, how the British always acted in India, particularly when they were challenged. It's all the same behaviour. I mean, admittedly, I think that the filming of yourself has probably allowed an even somehow being on camera might have allowed an even greater level of degenerated behaviour. It's an interesting question to revisit. Yeah. Where are we now? We've got to... Right. I think I've lost track of the chat here. If you just excuse me a moment. Right. Yes. Wayne Tables says, US and Britain have never been humbled. War is a game to us that happens far away. Israel is an extension of this. Never forced to examine our foundational myths, our delusion is protected by oceans. That's a good point. Like, Britain's actually lost wars. They've just been very good at lying about it. Like the British were defeated in Yemen in the 1960s. They were forced out by a long war of independence. But they very rarely talk about it. If you ask most British people if the British ever lost a war in the last 70 years, and they will tell you no. But of course, they lost in Yemen. They lost in Korea. They were defeated the US was in the lead on that one, but leading the supposedly UN force. But the British were heavily involved and they lost that war. But of course, it's covered over and called a draw. And yeah, I think in Vietnam, like the US loss there did cause something of a crisis in the US ruling class, but it was got over quite quickly because, again, like even though there was a draft back then, and even though more Americans were touched by it, it was still not the kind of like massive defeat and disaster that actually cost. 50-odd thousand Americans died in it, which is significant. But when you compare that to 3 million Vietnamese, the costs were way in the other direction in terms of the blood that was shed. So yes, Wayne's right, which is that a very public and undeniable defeat and disaster hasn't happened in this country. Well, I'm trying to think back now. The one that they couldn't possibly avoid acknowledging. Well, the Crimean War was formally a win for the British, but it caused the collapse of the government because the scandals of the Charge of the Light Brigade and the poor hospital conditions for the soldiery there, and the incompetence of the officers. That caused something of a problem, and that caused the government to resign, even though it was formally categorised as a win. World War One, formally a win, but caused a long-term problem that the British have never really solved. The crisis, of course, of imperialism, or was a manifestation, I should say, of a crisis of imperialism. Trying to think back now to when the last real public humiliation took place in Britain. I think you've got to go back really to the loss of the American colonies. Like there were other defeats, of course, along the way, but the fact that they lost the colonies in a military sense, they were defeated, and spent a lot of money being defeated, and that's kind of wiped out by the fact they managed to win the Napoleonic Wars quite soon afterwards, relatively soon. But yes, I think you've got to go back then to the time when the British ruling class were publicly and disastrously defeated. And that did cause them a crisis of confidence. They were very worried after that there was going to be like some sort of internal revolt. So yes, I think you have to go back to 1783 that the war finally ended. George Washington was the last man to publicly to be acknowledged as a public victor. Of course, Kim Il-sung and Chairman Mao defeated British forces in Korea, but that was covered up. They were successfully covered that over. Right. Ghosts of John Judge says, no community, no brotherhood of man, and ultimate reality is in the mind. That's the entire liberal conservative worldview. Yeah, and it comes out of the material, which is that the material basis for the existence of British capitalism has been exported overseas. Like you export a gigantic amount of commodity production, and you end up with an economy that is based on just exports of capital and financial services, and it manifests itself in the superstructure in the form of like just deluded fantasies and escapism, and that's for the ruling class. So like it's no wonder that they can try and recently it came out that in one of these British sort of think pieces that it was important to maintain the image of Britain as having always won its wars, even if it lost them. And if this image could be maintained, then Britain's influence in the world could be maintained. This was publicly stated. Like, so they were stating openly that the biggest task of the British ruling class now is just perception management. This is why you see like all these think pieces in the New York Times as well. The American ruling class is doing the same thing, saying it might feel like a recession, but in reality, the economy has never been better. Now, on one level, it's a simple act of manipulation in an election year from the Democratic Party. But on another level, it's even more insidious than that, because it's literally saying to people, well, you might feel as if you're broke and homeless and hungry, but in reality, you've never been in a richer country, And you get like, I saw an article pop up the other day. I should go back. I've saved it. I need to go back and read it. And it actually said, "Have you got money dysphoria?" So I mean, I read a bit of this and it was hilarious. It was like, do you feel like you've got more money than you do? So they've taken like gender ideology and now it's being applied to your bank account. Like, I identify as being much richer than I am. And again, it's all the same thing. It all comes back to our friend there's comment, which is it's the bourgeois ideology is now just collapsing into fantasies. I mean, they've always lied to the working class and the petty bourgeoisie about the way society is structured, who's really in charge, etc., what's really going on in the empire. But in actual fact, what's going on, and has been going on for a long time, is the fact that they themselves now believe the propaganda. They have come to actually regard all the stuff that they come out with as the truth. And they have actually psyoped themselves, I think a lot of them. Some of them are a little bit more perceptive, like some of the more ruthless characters in the British ruling class can see the writing on the wall and are trying to do something about it, but they've reached such a stage of complete hollowness of the state and the economy and society that they're going to find it rather difficult to do anything. Right, Albert Roundtree says capitalism always needs wars to survive, and that's correct. The only way out of the gigantic hole they're in now is to create a war, but that's going to be rather difficult for them at this stage. Carlos Chavez says, some of the evangelical Christians that I know told me some prophecy about a war between Russia and the Zionists, and of course the Zionists will defeat Russia. Yeah, well, there's a thing about prophecies. They tend to be rather inaccurate. I mean, to believe in that, you'd have to be like high on a very special variety of Zionism, which is, of course, Christian Zionism. Banana Bender says, Murray tried to play off the event like his freedom of speech was under attack. The only way his ideology works is if he's being perceived as the victim. Yeah, and again, like, this is like, I mean, this is the spokesman for Zionism and like Western civilization, this whining little fucking pussy, who's like, perpetually crying that he's being suppressed, and has been, by the way, like one of the most enthusiastic supporters of some of the most bloody and horrendous wars waged by US imperialism and British imperialism, and is always babbling on about civilization. Civilization to him just means the US invading a country, destroying the place and stealing everything. And then he goes around crying whenever anybody dares stand up to him. So in that sense, he's actually the perfect man to go around representing Israel internationally. Long may he do so. Ghost of John Judge says, ultimately, I believe that these criminals, the ruling class, may end up having to answer for their crimes when all is said and done, and that prospect terrifies them, especially if their secrets get out. Well, hopefully, and if there is a revolution in this country, we will have a reckoning. It'll be a very long reckoning, as there's an awful lot of people to get through to put on trial. But let's hope so. The evangelical Christians, this is Carlos Chavez, says, the evangelical Christians that I know don't believe that there are Nazis in Ukraine. Yeah, well, there's an awful lot of people who aren't evangelical Christians who still believe that. Some of them can't call themselves Marxists. Ash says, I like how their defense of Israel is tied with defending Western values. It ironically shows how Israel is artificially created in that region. Very true. Beju says, I can't stand Konstantin kissing. Yeah, well, that fucker is just a grifter. There's a long history of like defectors from the old USSR and now from Russia or from the former Soviet countries who come over and they learn what the ruling class wants to hear them say, and then they just come up with more and more wild ways to say it, because that's what keeps the checks rolling in. And that's what he's worked out. Like, it's been pointed out before, I forget by who in the Telegram chat, that he probably has quite a lot of contempt for his audience, because he tells them such wild bullshit about Russia and about the greatness of Western civilization. Like, he's just worked out, he's worked himself into a very nice gig where he goes to talk to rooms full of British bourgeois types who pay him an awful lot of money to tell them comforting myths. and to tell them their civilization is superior, to tell them that the evil Putin must fail, to tell them that the right side won the Cold War, to tell them that the immortal beauty of Western civilization will always prevail, but you've got to fight for it. Oh my God, you've got to fight for it. And start crying like Milei at the Wailing Wall. So, yeah, he's worked out a profitable gig for himself. He's a completely cynical opportunist. Right. Albert Roundtree says they don't have a pot to piss in, let alone buying back an energy company. Very Jordan Peterson-esque, says Jenny. Jordan Peterson, a man who is admired by like manosphere guys, but he's always crying and crying about Disney films. Oh my God, like the princess there has just like become like trans. It's horrendous. You know, like he's the motherfucker's crying over fucking Disney movies. And like, how the hell was this guy ever taken seriously? Also, how odd Argentina had an anti-Semitic dictatorship, which Milei has dismissed and downplayed. Yeah, well, anti-Semitism and Zionism are very compatible. Let's just say that. Is small man syndrome a real thing? I thought it was a smear against Napoleon. It kind of was, but also like there is a type of guy that you run into in pubs in Britain. I don't know if you get this in Australia and America also. Like, is like short, angry, overly aggressive guy, but who also like has a lot of bigger mates around him who he always tells to hold him back. It's a bit of a cliche, but it's rooted in reality. It's like, oh, what? You saying I'm a puff? Come on, I'll have you. I'll be back, lads. I'll be back. You know, that kind of stuff. It's like, again, it's a truism, but that's because it's rooted in the truth. Paul Gassari says, I blame Alex Jones for normalizing far-right macho men crying for the camera. Well, you know, in fairness to my namesake, you know, he's got 4 hours to fill, you know, or 8 hours a day. I mean, Jesus Christ, if you have to like talk the kind of stuff that he does and like repeatedly like raging away and like getting wound up, you'd probably have to do a whole bunch of meth before going on camera just to be able to do that for 8 hours a day. No wonder he's crying. Mary says, I wonder if Milei is an MK Ultra project. Now, that's a good point. We might do a show on MK Ultra. It's a great example of how like something that developed because the US bourgeois couldn't accept that American prisoners of war in Korea, once they were given courses on Marxism, Leninism to read, had converted to communism. It had to be a brainwashing project. So they started a brainwashing project to try and create people who would be perfect deep cover agents or something, and sent a load of people insane and might have caused the Manson murders. This is now turning into a Joe Rogan-esque episode, I can see. Right. Albert says, somehow I don't have much sympathy for Argentina. Many working class people obviously voted for their own enslavement. I understand what you mean, but I will never condemn people for, you know, not voting the right way in a bourgeois election. The choices in that election were both shit. Sergio Massa and the sort of remains of the Peronists ran a completely useless campaign and were overseeing a economic fuck-up of like huge varieties, huge scale, which of course wasn't entirely their fault, but stems from the fact that the Kirchners and the Peronists didn't fundamentally solve and couldn't solve any of the problems afflicting Argentine capitalism. And when you don't solve those for a long time, and you're not organized enough, the working class isn't organized enough in all the different areas of Argentina, it leaves the road open for these petty reactionaries and sort of demagogic figures, bankrolled by the bourgeois, to come in and gain some votes in an election. Because, again, like voting in bourgeois elections is the absolute lowest form of political consciousness. So it's not a surprise that people just looked at Milei's style, didn't really look at what he was saying, and said, yeah, we'll go with that guy. So I know what you mean, but I will not condemn Argentine workers who voted for him. I just hope that they realize what he's doing and helps to develop their class consciousness as a result. Dean says, your point about pension funds servicing Israeli bonds shows just how much more tactical precision is needed for the Palestine protests to be a threat. They lack the required discipline and strategy. That's true. Like, we've all done these Palestine protests, not just now, but in over many years. Some of the things they've been doing in Britain have been very effective, like blocking the Elbit, the arms manufacturer, really good. There's been some actions going after City of London firms and banks, also really good. Blocking like roads randomly, useless. Same true in the United States. You need to, I mean, as we've started doing here, examine how the various different methods that are used by the US imperialists and the British imperialists to support the Israeli colonial project, and target it accordingly. So, like, don't target, like, a major intersection of traffic in New York for no reason. I mean, those Jewish groups going out and blocking Biden's motorcade, excellent usage of blocking a road there. But it'd be more effective in British terms if you went and blocked, say, carried out like a peaceful blockade of American military bases that are supplying Israel, or carry out more actions inside these financial companies that are ensuring that Israel bonds get traded. Go after the various different other financial mechanisms that US imperialism uses to support the Israeli colonial regime, and there's plenty of them, and they're very easy to find out about. I mean, just doing an internet search for these stories brought me the Financial Times article about the Israel bonds. There's other institutions that exist, especially in Washington, D.C., to support Israel, and I'm fairly certain that Americans could find those and come up with creative solutions of protest on them. Dean's point is the correct one. MK Ultra could brainwash people to a high degree, says Mary. They thought they could. They could certainly break people's brains. I mean, I've seen the argument that Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was a victim of MK Ultra experiments. So they could certainly make people snap. I mean, Milei looks like something made him snap a long time ago. So maybe you're right. Wayne says a significant number of Milei's supporters hate Jews. We don't need to guess who those people will blame when Argentina goes down the tubes. It's Marxism for illiterate reactionaries. As Engels said a long time ago, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. They'll blame Jewish cabals. They'll also manage to blame Marxism. They'll say that Milei was actually manipulated by a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy this entire time that was run through the World Economic Forum, or something. Fascists always come up with anything other than their own class interests as being the reason why everything's fucking fallen apart. Banana Bender says, I'd recommend the documentary 9/11, The New Pearl Harbor. I watched that years ago. Many years ago. I need to go back to it again. Todd says, we have a 9/11 expert here in New Mexico. Interesting. Ghost of John Judge. Too many leftists dismiss conspiracy theory amongst the elites, when the very nature of capitalism dictates that they rule by conspiracy in order to maintain power, yet they see no contradiction. Yeah, there's conspiracies in the ruling class all the time. There's hidden agendas. There's plots that they carry out against each other. Like it's a tip of the iceberg thing. We see the tip of the iceberg. A lot of the stuff goes on under the water, so to speak. So conspiracies are constant. But it's the nature, as the Ghost of John Judge says, it's in the very nature of their role. They have to hide all the places they're actually making the decisions, because they can't have the decisions that really matter made out in the open, because that would be very damaging for them. So yes, conspiracy is in the very nature of their role, but it's in the nature of their class role. Whereas, like, your sort of Alex Jones types will see the conspiracy theory as something which is done by a sort of external group that is perverting an otherwise good system. Whereas we see it as like the conspiracies are generated by the nature of class rule. They have to keep things secret. They have to not debate things. They have to make sure that bourgeois democracy is a completely hollow shell. Dan Lindstrom says, Alex Jones is like Trump. Sometimes he accidentally hits something, right? Yeah, that's true. It's bad when the Saudis are backing away, says Jenny. That's true. Where are we now? Okay. Right. Movie Maker Joe says, The House of Saud have forever been amenable to any colonial comprador element rather than their own senses of power and natural authority. Do elaborate further. Well, I think there is an element in the House of Saud now that fancies itself as a sort of an independent actor. That's what Mohammed bin Salman symbolizes, I think. I think they're going to be proven wrong in the end. In the end, they'll get destroyed by the changes that are being wrought in the world like anybody else is. But I think some of them fancy themselves as some sort of great power of the Middle East in the making. They'll be proven wrong now. Right, where are we now? Okay. We lose all the wars we fight, but we haven't been conquered on our own land. These are all things that happen abroad and can be spun. We haven't been conquered the way Germany was twice. Yeah, true. British defeats. How about the Suez Crisis? Yes, they didn't lose the war, as they will always tell you if you get in an argument with a right winger. They lost because basically Eisenhower pulled the plug on the pound and forced them to withdraw. So that was a humbling experience for them, but it wasn't the disaster that I believe Wayne is referring to there. So yes, certainly a humbling, but not. And it caused Eden to fall. But bear in mind, the government that oversaw that, the party that oversaw it, got re-elected a couple of years later. So it wasn't the sort of apocalypse-level disaster that may be coming for them in the near future. Jenny says, I identify as a billionaire and will be treated as such. Yeah, just tell, next time you get a bill, just say, but I've already paid you. I've identified myself as having paid you. I've got money dysphoria. Don't discriminate against me. Banana Bender says, before the Holocaust, when Palestine was British, Germany had small settlements of religious communities in Palestine. Yes, going back quite a long way, I think. There was like German Christian settlers moving to Palestine way back in the later 19th century, I think. Ghost of John Judge says, like blaming everything on mental health, as if people just need some meds or have a hormone imbalance or something. Yes, some of the most horrendous employers I've worked for have all had like timeout rooms. Some of them have even had mental health professionals come in to lead collective meditation. Anything other than improving the conditions in the actual workplace. And of course, the tendency is to when you identify a mental health problem, just stick them on pills. And one of these days, by the way, we're going to do a deep dive into the work of Lysenko. And as part of my Lysenko was right season, where we're going to see just how little modern science actually understands about what causes disease. So stand by for the Lysenko was right season, probably coming next month. Beju says, the Israelis on social media seem proud to kill innocent Palestinians, including babies. Very odd. Perhaps betraying their elitist, supremacist ideology. I think I refer to my previous comment of betraying a very, very deep weakness. Like if you're, the supremacist ideology is part of it, but the supremacist ideology has been completely humiliated by October the 7th. And so everything they've done since then is just this very cruel and murderous way of trying to reassert themselves. Right. Otis says, I received this email from the PCS today. The wrong kind of crisis. HMRC has prevented PCS reps in Leeds from fundraising for a charity which is providing humanitarian aid for Gaza. Should say it's for Ukraine, then send it to Gaza. Yeah, but given that PCS is the union I used to be in, Public and Commercial Services Union. HMRC, if you're not familiar with it, is HM Revenue and Customs. It's the taxmen in Britain. And the union has a long history of being affiliated to Palestine Solidarity, so trying to do a collection is, of course, natural, and, of course, the British government doesn't want that happening anytime soon. Ghost of John Judge says, you're not being pressured by a ruthless system, you're just mentally ill. Take the pill. Wayne Table says, Britain and America lose every war they fight post-World War II, only because their stated aims are not their actual aims. They are accomplishing some of their goals, yet the public judge them on their stated goals. Interesting point. Quite true. Some British ex-military will also tell you that Britain is part of OPEC, and they argue the toss of that, letting know how they Propaganda deludes their departure from the UK. Yes, well, we're an oil-producing nation, but we're definitely not part of OPEC. But some people believe all kinds of things. Some people believe we're still in the EU. Constantine Kissing claims he's anti-identity politics, but says he's an immigrant Russian every other sentence. Yeah. Right. Where are we? Yep. Leave it, mate. He's not worth it, says Pulgasari in relation to short man syndrome. Yeah. Martin says the book Chaos and the Manson Murders is a must-read. I will add it to the list. Carlos says, what I learned about Argentina is that the Peronists or even Cristina Fernandez were not leftists. They are social democrats that follow capitalism's order. They always have meetings with the U.S. Embassy. Cristina openly says that she was in favor of capitalism. Yeah, they're social democrats at best, and they never had it in them. They never were as radical as a Chavez or a Morales figure or a Daniel Ortega figure. Even though they all still exist in fundamentally capitalist systems, all did things to empower the working class to at least set up a dual power situation, and they at least are in a position where they can say that they're in an ongoing revolutionary process, whereas the Argentines never did that and ultimately paid the price for it. Dan says, I've heard in Argentina 7 families are the head of own everything. I haven't investigated the structure of the Argentine ruling class, so I can't comment on that, but there was certainly like a very small cartel that owned all the land back in the 19th century, along with the British, of course. The British owned significant land in the 19th century. So 7, I mean, it could be plausible. I'll have to look further into it. Elite conspiracies against each other. Watergate, yeah. But that was like to cover up something even bigger. like Watergate was like presented to the public as, you know, bad man Nixon does bad things. But in actual fact, you had several different elements within the political structure there, all scheming against each other, including Nixon, including the FBI, the CIA, elements of the Democratic Party, all scheming against each other in the sort of the later period of the Vietnam War. So yeah, they fuck each other over and betray each other as a matter of course. But they all unify when threatened by the proletariat, of course, or most of them do. What is the very legal way of getting access to FT articles, asks Ash. It's a very, very legal browser called Firefox with a very, very legal extension that you can get to get past certain walls on certain websites in very, very legal ways. Have I made it clear? Hope so. Yeah, MBS is going to be very disappointed by the way things turn out, trust me. Hydra Operative says, okay, useless distinction. Goodbye and good night for you. I'm not even going to bother arguing with some dumb fascist. I've done arguing with fascists for 1 week. Base Lysenko for the win, says Jenny. Banana Bender says, you wouldn't get mediation rooms on a factory floor. My boss would laugh at the concept. Yeah, that's why I worked in the... You can tell I worked in the civil service. Yeah, this is very much a white-collar trend. Interesting comment from Ghost of John Judge. He says, one of the hidden elements of 20th century history is the role the Perons played in moving money out of Germany at the end of World War II and establishing the Bormann Brotherhood in Argentina. Interesting. He needs more research from me on that one, I think. Cartel land ownership, says Banana Bender. Argentina and Peru are very similar in that regard. Otis says, the HMRC did let the PCS and others fundraise for Ukraine. Great stuff. Great stuff. Of course they did. And of course PCS is dominated now by one of the, or if not dominated, then they have a large influence from one of the most crazy and utterly disgusting Trotskyite organizations, the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, or the Alliance of White Liberals. Wayne Table says, what Marxist figures in the public space do you perceive to be controlled opposition? It's telling that Tommy Robinson and Paul Mason were both exposed as controlled opposition on both sides of the mainstream spectrum. Yeah, I mean, there's Mason, of course, but then you get the entirety of British Trotskyism. I believe that the international Marxist tendency, if not controlled by the state, then influenced by it. The SWP were shown over and over again to be absolutely riddled with state informers, and they are, of course, an institutional part of the trade union bureaucracy. Whether my old party was or not, I'm not sure. There was some influence in there. So yeah, the British state's operations of both figures and organisations that purport to represent Marxism is very extensive and goes back a very long time. Muzzle Paint, solidarity to you and good evening. So very interesting discussion in the chat. So look forward to the Lysenko season. Thank you to everybody who's contributed to the chat this evening. There's been a bit of a problem uploading things to Patreon today, so today and yesterday's live stream will have to go up tomorrow because for some reason it's just not letting me upload any fucking audio at the moment. So I'll hopefully sort that out in the morning. Right, thank you to everybody who has contributed tonight and tuned in, and be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't already. And yes, do go to Patreon when it's working again if you want to support the program, or the Buy Me a Coffee link. And thank you to everybody who supports the show in both of those formats. And tune in again, same time tomorrow at 10:30, where we'll be back on the Ukraine beat. Until then, see you later.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so